Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so important, I think, that we do come together at this critical time. Our country's at war in Iraq. What can be more serious than war? There's a school down in Georgia that continues to train about 1,000 soldiers every year from many countries in Latin America. And we want that school shut down. Our president and other leaders in our country are really saying to us that our hope, that our trust will be found in our armies and our weapons. We have come to the conclusion, so many of us and a growing number of the people in our country, that it's a dead-end street, that it's in vain, that hope and trust does not come from our military or from our weapons. And I thought too recently about the words of Isaiah, how true it is when this Old Testament prophet said, they will take evil and call it good. They will take the lie and call it the truth. And they've become, leaders have become very skilled at that, to try and justify war. I'm happy to say that more and more of us have come to see the lie, the evil in it all. But it took me a long time to see that, and it took Vietnam perhaps to awaken something in me. The violence there, the suffering, the death, losing friends, let me just say, we are not made for the business of war. Our loving, caring God did not make us to go about the business of killing and go on with our lives as before. $100 billion is what our president's asking for this war in Iraq for this coming year. That's going to be attached, of course, to the $700 billion that we've already spent there. And what can we say? I think do believe that as people of faith, we've got to call it by its right name. It is a theft from the poor, here at home and abroad. It is a theft from our sisters and brothers who hunger, so many who simply won't make it beyond the age of 3 or 4. I met not long ago at Fort Benning a young soldier, Catherine Jasinski, 23 years old. Her unit came there to receive weapons training before going to Iraq. This young woman thought about whether she could actually take the life of another human being while going through that weapons training and behind that M16, and she simply said, I cannot kill another human being after long discernment and staying awake at night. And she simply said that life is very sacred, it's precious, it's a gift, and I cannot take away that gift from someone. She said to her commanding officer, I will not go to this war. She was court-martialed and sent to prison. And we supported her in prison, and when she got out of prison, we welcomed her and got together for a nice dinner. And she said, I was free in prison. I was free because I followed my conscience. And I think that's the way it works when we follow our conscience, when we really go about this business of peacemaking in a serious way. We are free. We find hope. And we could see that joy was still there in our heart. I came back from Vietnam just grateful to be alive, as so many did. But I came back seeking peace. I lost my hope in Vietnam, and that's what war does. It's doing that in Iraq. It kills hope. It destroys joy. And I wanted to find it again, and I was led to the Marino community by friends and a group working in 25 countries around the world. And I was assigned to Bolivia, our mission work in Bolivia, after I was ordained. And it was really my introduction to U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. The poor there became my teachers, and that's the way it works. When we dare to put our feet in the culture of the poor, the culture of others, we become children. We have so much to learn, if only we will listen. And they taught me about my country's foreign policy. We were supporting that brutal dictator, General Bonser, then, a graduate of this School of the Americas. Not only a graduate, but in the late 80s, he was inducted into the school's Hall of Fame, where his photograph was on the wall with some 20 other generals presented as model soldiers. I joined the struggle of the poor there, as did the Jesuits and so many people there. And I was among a large group arrested in my 5th year. I had to come home. It was a hard and lonely time. Didn't know really where to plug in. I then went to El Salvador with many after Archbishop Oscar Romero was gunned down in this little church for his defense of the poor. After 4 churchwomen from our country were raped and killed by the Salvadoran military. And that brought El Salvador much closer to home for many of us. And when we went to this little country, El Salvador, we found what the 4 churchwomen found, and Bishop Romero and so many others. It was a microcosm of Latin America, a military at war with its people. What we also found was our country, the United States, very deeply involved, giving guns, giving training to those soldiers during the killing. And that was a crime against humanity. That was wrong. We came back from El Salvador, and of course we could not shut up. We had to speak out. And when we read that down at Fort Benning, Georgia, 500 soldiers from El Salvador had just arrived to undergo their weapons training, to learn the art of killing. We went there to simply say, not in our name. They arrested us, took us to jail and then to trial, and we were sent to prison for 1.5 years. And like Catherine Szyczynski, we said, no regrets, no regrets. We were free in prison, and what we discovered, as so many before us, that they could send us to prison, but the truth cannot be silenced. When we got out of prison, we went back to work, but we couldn't stop the military aid to El Salvador. It continued. One night they went after the Jesuits at their university in San Salvador. They were very upset with the Jesuits because they were educators, they were peacemakers. They were telling the world about what was going on in El Salvador. And they entered their university campus after midnight, the military did, and dragged the 6 Jesuits out of their rooms along with the young mother, Elba, their co-worker, and her teenage daughter, Selena. And they were shot at close range. They were massacred. And this hit the front pages of our newspapers. And it angered members of Congress who had supported and gave their blessing to the $1 million a day that was arriving there from our tax money to go into the military. So they went to investigate and came back home reporting that those who did the killing were trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, in a school called the U.S. Army School of the Americas. And that's when we returned to Fort Benning, and right outside of the main gate, we moved into this little apartment, called it the SOA Watch. We didn't have a movement back then. Simply a kindred spirits coming together who were just outraged, really, about what our country was doing in El Salvador. A Jesuit came from Boston. Kathy Kelly came from Chicago. A couple of Dominicans, 3 Salvadorans, some university students who had to flee their country with death threats joined us. And also, with us also was Charlie Litke, who we remember this evening. We came together and fasted at the main gate for 35 days and then did research and began to discover the truth about this school. We learned that over 60,000 soldiers trained here from 18 countries in Latin America. They came here to learn counterinsurgency techniques. What we learned in asking the question, who are the insurgents, we learned that they were primarily the poor of their countries who called for land reform. for a living and just wage, for health care, for schools. This is what this struggle is about. For food for the table. They went after the labor leaders, of course, as they're doing in Colombia, the most dangerous country in Latin America in the world, really, to organize in. They went after the healthcare workers, the human rights advocates. They went after the church leaders, as they did in the case of Bishop Romero and the Jesuits and the church women. The targets were those who threatened that socioeconomic system that kept the rich rich and the poor poor. Something happened when word began to spread about this school, when the United Nations Truth Commission report documented that those who killed Bishop Romero trained here. The 5 who raped and killed the church women, 4 of them graduates. The 28 who killed the Jesuits and the 2 women, 19 of them graduates. And the list simply went on and on. And what happened was people began now to gather at the main gate of Fort Benning in November, around the date of the massacre of the Jesuits and the 2 women, simply to keep their memory alive and the memories of the thousands, really, whose voices were taken away by graduates of this school. That first year, we had just a handful of us, and then the next year, 100 came, and then 500, then 1,000, then 2,000. Well, this last year, over 22,000 gathered. And I just want to say, in this sea of people that we looked over there, it was just a great joy to see that. To see there over half were high school and university students. To see all of the senior citizens, grandmothers for peace, always with us from the Bay Area. To see the military veterans who see this issue as bringing shame to our country. The many nuns who joined our group in the very beginning, still with us. When we gather, it's this big celebration of hope. We're speaking truth to power. So many of our brothers and sisters cannot come to our country to tell their story. Stories that are filled with suffering, death, grieving, disappearances of so many of their loved ones. And so we feel, because of what we know, because of living in El Imperio, the empire, because of what our foreign policy is doing to them, we feel this obligation to gather, to speak with them, to remember them, and to call for the closing of this school. At our next big annual strategy meeting, we came up with, of course, the Latin America initiative. We said, let's go to all of these countries with soldiers at this school and try and set up meetings with their heads of state, with their defense ministers and indigenous leaders and university leaders, in request that they pull their troops out, for the simple reason that this school is a scandal. This school is really about stealing from the poor, causing suffering and oppression to the poor. We got an invitation from friends in Venezuela. Come to Caracas and meet with President Hugo Chavez. We think we can set up a meeting with him. Well, it didn't take us long. A group of us were on that plane headed to Venezuela, and we first went into the barrio surrounding Caracas. And it was such a joy to see the excitement of the people. That despair that lived in Venezuela for so long has now been replaced by hope. Why? Because their president and their leaders are now taking billions of dollars from their oil revenues, a country so wealthy in petroleum, and directing that money for the first time to the poor. There are these literacy programs, new houses that are replacing the shacks. They're getting running water. They have health care. Schools are being built. it's an exciting time. As we know, this is good news for the poor. But for the wealthy, it's bad news. It's bad news. And for many of the architects of war in our country, it's bad news. And they are trying to discredit this president, but it's difficult. His ratings there are something like 88%, his poll ratings. At that meeting with President Chavez, we were all a little nervous. I had never met with the president of a country before. And I struggle with Spanish. It always was difficult for me. Often when I speak Spanish, they think I'm speaking in an indigenous language. But I have to tell you, with Lisa Sullivan, who is our Latin America coordinator, and others there who were so fluent in Spanish. But President Chavez understood very clearly why we were there. And that hour-long, very friendly meeting, it was to request that Venezuela withdraw their troops from this school, a country that had sent over 4,000 over the years. And the president said he would get back to us. He had to consult his ministers. And just 3 weeks later, at our national office in Washington, D.C., they received notification, an official letter saying that Venezuela made a decision to immediately withdraw all of their troops. And that soon after, we were on a plane headed to Argentina and Uruguay, where there we met with their defense ministers. And just a couple of days after each of those meetings with the defense ministers in Argentina and Uruguay, these countries made a decision to pull out all of their troops. So now we're feeling emboldened. We're kind of feeling like we're on a roll here. We went to Bolivia from there. Eduardo Galeano from Uruguay spoke at the inauguration of President Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, a country where more than 70% of its people are indigenous, and now he's the first indigenous president. And that's very hopeful. And but Eduardo Galeano, at the inauguration of Evo Morales, put it this way. He said, today, el miedo está muerto. This fear is dead in this country today. It has been replaced by hope, And I want to say, dear friends, that that's what's going on in Latin America today, this fear that was instilled by their militaries, and really armed and trained, militaries armed and trained by our country. It's being replaced by hope. There are many countries now bringing into leadership leaders who are really speaking the language of the poor. And that is very, very promising. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.